5 minutes after the last guest had raised a toast to his health, Mark was led out of the reception hall in handcuffs. The orchestra, unsure of what else to do, played the song to the very end, the same one he had danced to with his new wife barely an hour earlier. He was still smiling, adjusting the cuff of his shirt, when two plainclothes officers approached him. The expression frozen on his face was that of a man who, until the very last second, had believed the whole world belonged to him. But it had all begun very differently. In a house where the smell of antiseptic became as familiar to me as home itself, and where my only companion was my paralyzed mother, whose eyes said more than any words ever spoken by the rest of my family. My name is Claire Whitfield, and 8 years ago I was what everyone in our family called the convenient one. Convenient because I lived closest to my parents' house in the suburbs of Guildford. Convenient because I had neither a husband nor children to hold me back. Convenient because I had spent my entire life saying yes. When my mother, Margaret, suffered a stroke, no one even asked whether I was willing to leave my job at an architectural firm and move back into my childhood home. The decision had already been made for me, collectively, over a family dinner I hadn't even been invited to. I was simply informed of it the next morning over a cup of coffee. At the time, my brother Mark was opening his second chain of car dealerships and was far too busy to take on even a fraction of the responsibility. My sister Emma was married to a successful stockbroker and ran an Instagram blog about balancing motherhood with yoga and luxury travel. Both of them had perfectly reasonable excuses. Both of them had airtight alibis built on busy schedules. And neither of them had the slightest desire to watch the woman who had once been so strong become someone dependent on adult diapers and 4 drips. I was the one who quit my job, sold my apartment in London, and moved back into the house where I had grown up. From that day on, my life followed a schedule that I hadn't written. I still remember those first few months. Every morning I got up at 5 when the alarm went off, though it felt almost cruel because I hadn't slept even a full hour. After the stroke, my mother could barely speak, but her eyes followed me around the room, filled with gratitude mixed with shame over what she had become. I changed her sheets, treated her bedsores, fed her spoonfuls of oatmeal she reluctantly swallowed, and gave her medication exactly on schedule, carefully sorted into small plastic containers labeled morning, afternoon, and evening. I memorized the creak in the floorboard beneath the 3rd step from the bedroom door, so I wouldn't wake her too early. Even the constant hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen became a kind of lullaby that accompanied the brief moments of sleep I managed to steal between caregiving tasks. Calls from Mark and Emma were brief and almost insultingly predictable. "How is she?" Mark would ask, while I could hear the sounds of the dealership behind him. Engines running, sales managers talking, phones ringing. "Stable," I'd answer. He would immediately say goodbye, as though he were afraid I might ask for something more than simply providing an update. Emma called even less often, but there was always criticism in her voice. She'd ask whether I'd remembered to buy our mother the expensive skin cream she'd ordered online, as though my days were filled with spare time I could spend shopping for cosmetics. Not once did either of them offer to come for a weekend, so I could catch up on sleep or see a doctor myself. By then, my own health was already beginning to fall apart. I'll remember that Tuesday near the end of my second year as Mom's caregiver for the rest of my life. I hadn't slept properly in nearly 3 weeks. She had developed severe insomnia and called for me every 2 hours. Completely exhausted, I mixed up the dosage of one of her heart medications. An hour after taking it, her face began turning a frightening shade of gray. Her breathing became rapid and uneven. Panicking, I called 911. My hands shook so badly that I had to dial the number 3 times because my fingers simply wouldn't obey me. The doctors stabilized her in intensive care, and during the 4 days she spent in the hospital, I sat outside her room on a hard plastic chair, unable to forgive myself for a mistake that had almost cost her life. When Mark and Emma learned what had happened, neither of them came to the hospital. Instead, 2 days later they sent their shared attorney, a man named Mr. Pearson, to the house. Polite but persistent, he questioned me in detail about the incident, clearly preparing documentation in case legal issues arose later. "We just want to understand the risks," he told me, looking somewhere past my shoulder instead of at me. That was the first time I felt something inside me truly crack, not from exhaustion, but from realizing that to my own brother and sister I wasn't family. I was a potential liability. After that, Mom lived for another 3 years. Throughout that time, Mark and Emma occasionally stopped by the house to, as they put it, see how things were going. In reality, their visits consisted of a quick inspection of her room, disgusted glances at the medical equipment, and quiet conversations in the kitchen. One afternoon I accidentally overheard Emma, adjusting her earrings in the hallway mirror, whisper to Mark, "She can't be trusted with Mom's finances. You've seen what happened with the medication." I stood behind the half-open door holding a tray and said nothing. Because I knew the truth wasn't in the words they spoke aloud. The truth was what remained after the lights were turned off and the front door closed behind the last visitor. That was when I started keeping records. At first it was simply a journal, something to keep me from losing my mind in all that silence. But gradually it became something much more. I recorded the dates of every visit, the details of every conversation, the amounts of money Mark periodically borrowed from Mom, always claiming temporary business difficulties. The strange legal documents Emma once brought for her to sign, while Mom was in no condition to understand what she was signing. At the time, I didn't even know why I was doing it. Something deep inside simply told me to keep every receipt, every text message, every document, every detail. My mother died on a cold November morning, peacefully. In her sleep, her weakened hand was wrapped around mine. I believed that after her death there would at least be a brief period of peace. A time for mourning, when our family might finally be together without calculations or hidden agendas. I was catastrophically wrong. 2 days after the funeral, while I was sorting through Mom's belongings in her bedroom, Mark and Emma arrived together without warning. They carried a thick leather portfolio. Standing in the doorway, they announced that we needed to clear up a few formalities. The formality turned out to be the reading of Mom's will, scheduled for the following week. As it happened, I was the last person to find out about it. We sat in the office of Mr. Hodges, the notary, a gray-haired man with the tired eyes of someone who had witnessed dozens of families tear themselves apart. He read the document in a calm, monotone voice. It took me a few moments to grasp what he was saying. The house, the savings, the investment portfolio. Everything was to be divided equally between Mark and Emma. My name appeared only once. I was left a symbolic £5,000 in appreciation for household assistance during the final years of the mother's life. I remember the silence that settled over the room. I remember Mark looking at Emma with a satisfied grin he made no effort to hide. They exchanged the triumphant glance of people who had planned this outcome long ago and were finally hearing it made official. Mom always said financial matters should be left to people who actually understand them, Mark said, straightening his cuff link as though he had rehearsed the line in front of a mirror. Emma added, her voice dripping with rehearsed sympathy, "Don't worry. If things ever get difficult, you're always welcome to stay with us." I walked out of the notary's office feeling something that's hard to put into words. Not anger, not despair, but a kind of icy clarity, as though someone had dumped a bucket of cold spring water over me. The moment we stepped into the reception area, Mr. Hodges's phone rang. From the fragments of conversation that drifted our way, it became clear the call was from the bank about an urgent freeze on one of the family accounts. Mark went pale, apologized, and stepped into the hallway to take the call, while Emma nervously twisted the strap of her purse, trying to figure out what was happening. But that was only the first and faintest echo of what was still to come. A month before my mother died, I had hired an attorney named Helen Barrow, a tough, reserved woman who specialized in family financial disputes. For weeks, she had been methodically gathering evidence that Mark had systematically siphoned money from my mother's accounts under the guise of business development loans that were never repaid. She also uncovered evidence that Emma had forged my mother's signature on documents transferring ownership of investment holdings on 3 separate occasions, while my mother was in no condition to make informed financial decisions. The first time I brought Helen my records, a stack of worn notebooks filled with dates, copies of bank statements I had quietly photographed over the years, and audio recordings of conversations I had made just in case. She spent a long time flipping through them without saying a word. Finally, she looked up at me. "Claire," she said, "do you realize what you have here? This isn't just a family dispute. It's fraud against an incapacitated person and document forgery." I still remember my breath catching. Not from fear, but from suddenly understanding the scale of what I had unknowingly documented over so many years. "What am I supposed to do with all this?" I asked. Helen answered calmly, without the slightest urgency, in the tone someone uses when discussing something inevitable. "Nothing for now. Keep collecting evidence. Verify every date. And most importantly, don't let them know you know anything." Those words became my compass for the next 6 months. I began working methodically, almost like a researcher conducting a long-term study. I regained access to my mother's old bank statements through customer service, explaining that I needed them to settle inheritance matters. I found a witness, a caregiver named Rosalind, who had briefly cared for my mother before I did. One day she had accidentally witnessed Emma forcing my mother to sign paperwork by physically guiding her hand because my mother could no longer hold a pen on her own. Rosalind hesitated for a long time, afraid of becoming entangled in someone else's family conflict. But after I explained that this wasn't about revenge, it was about justice for someone who could no longer defend herself, she agreed to provide a sworn written statement. At the same time, I hired an independent forensic accountant, Mr. Davis, to conduct a complete audit of every transaction involving my mother's accounts over the previous 5 years. The report he produced was a sobering document of more than 40 pages. It detailed systematic transfers totaling more than £300,000 to Mark's company, disguised as interest-free loans with no repayment provisions whatsoever. It also documented the transfer of my mother's investment portfolio into Emma's name just 1 week before my mother was diagnosed with progressive dementia, a fact that made the transaction legally vulnerable from the outset. While all of this was happening behind the scenes, I continued living what appeared to be a perfectly ordinary life around Mark and Emma. We occasionally crossed paths at family dinners, where they treated me with the same patronizing politeness as always, though without their former hostility. Apparently, they believed the matter had been settled. One evening, Mark even offered me a part-time administrative job at one of his dealerships. He presented it like an act of extraordinary generosity. "You need the money now anyway," he said. I thanked him politely and declined, explaining that I was looking for work in my own field. What I didn't tell him was that I had already begun consulting with an investigative business journalist who specialized in exposing misconduct within family-owned companies. That was when the first major breakthrough occurred. Helen discovered that one of the so-called business loans Mark had taken from my mother hadn't been used to expand his dealerships at all. Instead, the money had gone toward paying off a personal gambling debt owed to a bookmaker, a debt he had never disclosed to either his wife or his business partners. At first glance, the detail seemed almost insignificant. In the end, it became the pebble that started the avalanche. Eventually, Helen informed me that we had assembled enough evidence to file a lawsuit challenging the will and seeking to invalidate several financial transactions on the grounds that my mother lacked legal capacity when they were executed. "The only question," she said, "is whether you want to resolve this quietly through negotiations or whether you want a public court battle." I thought about that question for a long time, remembering every humiliation, every look of contempt, every whispered insult behind my back. Finally, I answered, "I want them to offer to give back what they took. And I want them to find out that I know everything before they realize what's actually happening." The plan itself was simple in design, but it demanded absolute precision in execution. First, Helen sent Mark and Emma a formal notice informing them that legal action was being prepared. The letter deliberately withheld the specific evidence. It simply stated that the executor had obtained grounds to believe there had been serious irregularities surrounding the preparation of the will. The notice had exactly the effect we expected. It threw them into a panic. But instead of turning that panic toward me, they turned it on each other. Each believed the other had made the mistake that was about to bring everything crashing down. I learned about it from a longtime family acquaintance who happened to attend a dinner where Mark, after a few too many drinks, accused Emma of putting the entire estate at risk with her forged signatures. Emma fired back that his gambling debts posed a far greater threat than any forged paperwork ever could. Their alliance, built entirely on mutual self-interest, began cracking long before I ever said a single word. A week after receiving the notice, Mark called me himself. For the first time in years, his usual air of condescension was gone. "Claire," he said, "we need to talk. No lawyers. Just family." For the first time, I heard something in his voice that had never been there before. Uncertainty. I agreed to meet, but on one condition. The meeting had to take place at my parents' house, the same house where I had spent all those years caring for my mother. The symbolism of that place mattered to me every bit as much as the conversation that was about to unfold. Mark began indirectly, talking about how families should stick together and how old grudges needed to be left behind for the greater good. The three of us met in the living room, where our mother's hospital bed had once stood. Now there was only the empty space we had deliberately left untouched after her death. Emma sat across from me, nervously twisting her wedding ring and avoiding my gaze. "We're prepared to revisit the distribution of the inheritance," Mark finally said, clearly expecting relief and gratitude. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder, the same kind of deliberate, symmetrical gesture they had used against me several months earlier, and placed it on the coffee table between us. "Before we discuss numbers," I said evenly, "I'd like both of you to review what's inside." Mark picked up the folder with the irritation of someone expecting an easy victory. But as he turned the pages, bank statements, Rosalind's sworn testimony, the forensic accountant's report, his face slowly drained of color. "Where did you get all this?" Emma asked quietly, genuine fear creeping into her voice for the first time. "The same place I found the time to watch what was happening while the two of you were too busy to ask how I was holding up," I replied. The room fell into a silence that I would later remember as the exact moment their carefully constructed world began to collapse, quietly but beyond repair. Mark quickly shifted to offense, insisting that every document could be challenged, that the caregiver's testimony would never hold up in court, and that I was bluffing. Without saying a word, I took out my phone and played an old voice recording, the one in which Emma, years earlier, had stood in front of the hallway mirror questioning whether I could ever be trusted. She had no idea the dining room door had been slightly open or that I had been standing just behind it, holding a serving tray. Her voice echoed through the room, calmly speaking about how unreliable she believed I was. Standing alone, the recording might have meant very little. But alongside everything else I had uncovered, it became evidence of something far more important: how coldly and deliberately they had viewed me from the very beginning. Emma snatched up her phone and started dialing her husband, but I gently interrupted. "It's too late to scramble now," I said. "Copies of every document are already with my attorney, an independent forensic accountant, and, just to be safe, in a bank safe deposit box." "This isn't blackmail," I continued, looking each of them in the eye. "It's an opportunity to settle this before it reaches a courtroom, and the newspapers. The journalist I've been consulting is waiting for one phone call." Only a minute earlier, Mark had radiated confidence. Now he suddenly looked years older. "What exactly do you want?" he asked. I answered without hesitation. "A complete revision of the will restoring my rightful share of the estate, including the house, and financial compensation equal to the money you already siphoned from Mom's accounts. I also want the investment portfolio transaction formally declared invalid. And most importantly, I want a public apology to the family, not one forced by a judge, but one spoken here and now." Emma burst into tears. But by then I knew exactly what those tears were worth. Years of caring for our mother had taught me the difference between genuine grief and a performance. This was a performance, not an expression of remorse, but one final attempt to win sympathy. "You want to destroy us," she whispered. "No, Emma," I answered calmly without anger. "I want back what rightfully belongs to me, and what you took from Mom while she couldn't defend herself. You destroyed yourselves long before this conversation." Trying to salvage some measure of control, Mark offered a compromise. It wasn't nearly enough for me to accept. I picked up my recorder from the coffee table. "Our next conversation," I said, "will be with your attorneys and my legal team present." They left that evening in strained silence. I remained alone in the house where I had once cared for my mother, feeling no triumph, only a quiet determination to see everything through. The next 2 months disappeared into negotiations, legal correspondence, and repeated attempts by Mark and Emma to minimize the damage. They hired their own forensic accountant to dispute Mr. Davis's report. Instead, the independent review confirmed every one of his conclusions and uncovered another damaging fact. Mark hadn't used the diverted money solely to cover gambling debts. He had also been financing an affair that his wife knew nothing about. The discovery surfaced accidentally during the financial investigation and became the final blow to Mark's marriage. After learning the truth through documents filed in the civil case, his wife filed for divorce within a week, taking the children and half of their marital assets, much of which, ironically, had been built using the very money taken from our mother. Then the dominoes began to fall. After reading the public court filings detailing Mark's financial misconduct within his own family, his business partners started reevaluating their relationships with him, worried about the reputations of their own companies. One of the largest auto dealership groups that had been negotiating a merger with Mark publicly withdrew its offer, citing irreconcilable differences in business ethics. As local news outlets covered the lawsuit, customers began avoiding Mark's dealerships. Sales dropped so sharply that the bank financing his business initiated a review of his loan agreements. Emma faced consequences of a different kind. Her reputation in local social circles had been built around the image of a successful, flawless broker's wife. That image shattered once the story of forging our incapacitated mother's signature reached the press through the investigative journalist I ultimately contacted. But only after settlement negotiations had completely collapsed. Advertisers canceled their partnerships one after another. Former friends made a point of avoiding her at charity galas and social events. The climax came during the court hearing over the validity of the investment portfolio transaction. Mark and Emma appeared together, united for the first time in months by a shared crisis. Even so, the strain between them was impossible to miss. After reviewing Rosalind's testimony, the forensic accounting reports, the recordings, and the correspondence, the judge ruled in my favor with little hesitation. The investment transaction was declared void, and Mark was ordered to return the diverted funds with interest. When everything was over, Mark approached me in the courthouse hallway in one last attempt to preserve a shred of dignity. "You got what you wanted," he said bitterly. "Happy now?" "I got justice, Mark," I replied, meeting his eyes. "Whether you're satisfied with what you've turned your life into for money that never belonged to you, that's your question to answer, not mine." Throughout the legal proceedings, I stayed in contact with Victoria Stone, an investigative reporter for a respected business newspaper whom I had met during the early stages of preparing the case. Victoria specialized in family business disputes and warned me from the beginning that publicity was a weapon that had to be used carefully. Releasing the story too soon, she explained, could alert the wrong people and give them time to cover their tracks. We agreed that her article would not be published until after the court issued its ruling, ensuring that every claim rested on official court records rather than speculation. Then, one evening, a week before the hearing, Victoria called with information that shifted the balance even further. While reviewing public corporate filings, she discovered that Mark's dealership group had spent the previous 2 years hovering on the edge of bankruptcy. The business had survived only because of a steady stream of cash disguised as investments from a shell company registered in the name of his current girlfriend. In other words, the money stolen from our mother had done far more than cover Mark's gambling debts. It had been systematically funneled through a network of companies to conceal the true extent of his financial problems from banks, investors, and business partners. I passed this information on to Helen. After reviewing the documents, she concluded that the scheme could be classified not merely as a civil violation, but as criminal fraud involving money laundering. "This changes everything," she told me over coffee in her office. "The case is no longer just a family dispute. It's now the kind of matter that attracts the attention of an entirely different set of authorities." I could feel the ground shifting beneath Mark's feet, even though he continued to appear in public as the confident businessman he had always pretended to be. He had no idea that his financial empire was hanging by threads that could snap at any moment. The turning point in that separate chain of events came almost by chance, although that chance had been months in the making. After the company's credit rating was downgraded, the bank financing Mark's car dealerships conducted a routine review and requested additional documentation regarding the sources of his funding. The discrepancies that surfaced were serious enough for the bank's financial compliance team to refer the matter to the police, long before our family case ever reached a courtroom. The police quietly opened an investigation, gathering evidence behind the scenes while the civil court was deciding whether the transfer of the investment portfolio should be declared invalid. Consumed by his efforts to salvage his reputation during our civil lawsuit, Mark never realized that an entirely different case file was already being assembled behind his back. One far more devastating than anything I could ever have brought against him myself. Several months after our legal battle had ended, it came to light that, in a desperate attempt to restore his finances, Mark had become involved in a fraudulent insurance scheme involving inflated vehicle valuations. That scheme ultimately led to his arrest, at his own wedding to his new bride, the very mistress for whom he had once squandered our mother's money. The police investigating the insurance fraud had been monitoring his activities for quite some time, and the timing of the arrest became a fitting end to a story that had begun with the betrayal of a sister and ended with a downfall Mark had built for himself, step by step, without any direct intervention from me. When Emma learned about the arrest of the former fiancé of her would-have-been sister-in-law, in other words, the very public disgrace of her brother, she withdrew completely. She moved to another city, far away from familiar faces and judgmental stares. We did not speak for more than 2 years. When she finally sent me a brief message apologizing, I replied politely but without warmth. Some doors are not closed out of anger. They are closed because protecting your own peace sometimes leaves no other choice. After the will was successfully challenged and revised, I inherited the family house. 6 months later, I sold it. Every room reminded me not only of my mother, but also of years filled with humiliation, exhaustion, and helplessness. With the proceeds, I bought a modest apartment overlooking a park in a quiet part of London. For the first time in years, I allowed myself the life I had always dreamed of, traveling, reading, and spending time with people who valued me not for what I could do for them, but for who I was. Some evenings, as I poured myself a cup of tea and watched the sunset beyond my window, I would remember those endless days beside my mother's bed, the creaking floorboards, the constant hum of the refrigerator, the smell of medication. Those memories no longer hurt. They simply reminded me of how far I had come. I realized that my moment of weakness on that fateful Tuesday, the one that had nearly cost my mother her life, had paradoxically become the first step toward seeing my family for who they truly were. In the end, that realization freed me far more than any amount of money ever could. The keys to my new apartment rested on the small table by the front door. They felt surprisingly light, carrying none of the weight of the past that I had borne for so many years. If my mother could have seen me now, I believe she would have been proud of the life I had chosen. I had refused to remain someone's unpaid caregiver and the silent victim of endless family manipulation. I finished my tea, and for the first time in many years it no longer tasted bitter. The past no longer weighed me down. Whenever acquaintances occasionally asked what had become of my brother and sister, I simply answered that, in the end, everyone receives what they have earned. Justice, I had learned, does not always require revenge. Sometimes it requires nothing more than patience, and the wisdom to wait for the moment when the truth finds its own way into the light. The silence in my new apartment no longer frightened me. It belonged to me alone, and it was more valuable than anything else I had gained after everything I had endured.